I love you guys.
Welcome to the Torg Stories podcast with my usual partner, my sister Anne, in Prague today. On my own, looking at the question, is the end of reading here? Using Rose Horowitz's article in The Atlantic, the end of reading is here for some of the conversation. As far as me being a podcast listener, sometimes I miss what I feel like are my buddies when they don't do a podcast. Just I look forward to hearing from them every week. Sometimes they are people I know, sometimes I don't know them at all. But decided to go ahead and do it on my own, tell you what I've been up to, talk about reading a little bit, just so we can stay in touch. So I've got a link at thetorg.com to The Atlantic. I think they might give you a couple free reads a month. I'm a subscriber. I think I get an educational rate as well. It's less than $100. So I mostly like The Atlantic. I read it. I look at it almost every single night when I get into bed. That might be something I bring up a little bit later. Got a lot going on. Let's see. We're getting the house ready to sell. My wife Megan had me scraping tiny parts of white paint off of windows. Like Megan has done almost all of the painting in our house. And so, she'll tape off, maybe she painted the window frame, something, but a tiny bit of paint gets on the window. So yesterday, had a box cutter squeaking away on the window, trying to get the paint off. I did a below average job, probably. So that seems like a level of detail that not everyone would go to. Certainly not me if I was on my own. I wonder if people would be interested in a podcast about getting ready to sell your house. There's free things like decluttering, lots of trips to the dump, selling a few things on Facebook, giving away a lot, all the way up to a new roof and the house painted and 2 bathroom remodels, which cost a lot. Home equity loan. So, what lengths are you willing to go to make your house worth more? And is it worth it? We don't know yet. Maybe the listing's coming up here in a week. Going to the Coaches Association clinic tomorrow. You've got to show up to get your card. You need your card to do things, to vote for awards such as All District. That's probably one of the big things that makes people want to go. And so they make you come every year. And so I'm getting up at 5 something in the morning. I'm leaving around 6. I'll be there when the doors open to get my card. And then there's events like rules meetings, an all-star game, coaches meeting. And then it's less than a month until I drive my daughter Izzy to the University of Utah. Probably the plan is it's 30 hours. So it's either 3 days of 10 hours or 2 15-hour days. We'll see what Iz wants to do. I'm going to drive a car out there with all their stuff. My wife is flying out there to meet her. I will turn around the next day and drive home so I can be home for App State classes. So I'll get to check out the University of Utah, I think, for less than 24 hours. Maybe we'll go one day early. But all that costs money, everyone. Okay, so the end of reading is here. I wanted to read the paragraph. Whoo, I got to go fast. The end of reading is here. There's a paragraph I want to read to you starting. It's an incredible article, and there's a lot of laying the foundation of reading over the course of human history. And it maybe even my skipping around to talk about sections sort of proves her point about reading, just all of the device stuff that causes you to skim instead of read deeply. But of course, there are times to skim and times to read deeply. So I think some interesting statistics in this paragraph, 4 or 5 paragraphs down. I'm going to read that to you to get us going and talk about some of what's in here. Some 2,000 years later, under very different circumstances, the darkness is gathering again. Americans, once members of a proudly literate society, read much less than they used to. According to the National Endowment for the Arts, which conducts the most comprehensive survey of the nation's reading habits, fewer than half of all adults reported having read a book of any kind in 2022. Only 38% read a novel or a short story. A study analyzing 236,000 responses to the American Time Use Survey found that the proportion of Americans who read for pleasure on any given day fell from 28% in 2004 to 16% in 2023. The study looked at people who had read a book, magazine, or newspaper, listened to an audio book, or read an ebook. Gambling has become a more common leisure activity than reading a book. Last year, 57% of Americans placed a bet. I was just thinking how, one, I've placed a bet and read multiple books. But I was just thinking it's been a long. Oh, I did place. I think my last bet was when Norway lost in the World Cup. So the betting is declining. Okay, back to reading. I latched on to that. Fewer than half of all adults reported having read a book of any kind in 2022. Certainly not here to disprove the theory that the end of reading is here. Just talking about my own reading and reading that I observed. My friend Dave Witzig, who, by the way, appears in my novel, a fictionalized version of him, Love on the Big Screen, The Brothers in Pursuit. Dave Witzig is cowboy in that book. So Dave Witzig really was cowboy in college, but the character, for several reasons, is obviously not him. He texted me this week and asked me what we were reading. Should I try to pull up Dave's text without asking him? He actually sent me three different texts that included his reading. Let's see what he's got here. Oh, did I text him in a different text? Maybe that didn't show up on my computer. Oh, here it is. I'm reading The Wager, a tale or shipwreck, mutiny, and murder about a 1740s British ship going around South America. Lord Byron's grandpa was on the ship. Incredible story. So reading is still in my life to the degree that my friend Dave, who I hear from once every other month at the most, um, texted me that he's reading that book and wanted to know what I was reading. My wife and I are daily readers. I asked my wife Megan this morning how many books she thought she read this year. She estimated 20-ish, and she said they're all novels. Last month, I think it was, we went to Huzzah Books. I feel like that's not how they say it. Huzzah Books in Boone, a great. Is it all used books? Or there's some? Oh, there are obviously some new books because I bought my colleague Zachary Vernon's book, Eating on a Mountain at the End of the World. So they do sell new books. I would estimate at least 40 people, pretty good crowd, showing up for Zach's reading. Part of the reading was like a stand-up comedy act. It was so funny. So I recommend Zach's book. And then there's been the shocking resurgence. Is it a resurgence? I don't know if I'm going to label it a resurgence yet. Of my daughter's reading. My daughters are 18 and 20. Izzy is getting ready to go to the University of Utah. Charlotte will be a junior, holy smokes, nearby Lees McRae. Both of them have been really digging in on reading, like 100 pages in a day, reading novels in the last week. Well, I guess in the last 2 weeks, maybe is when they started. Maybe is a little earlier. Is like on the third book of a series. So my wife and I used to say so much for parents who model reading because our daughters didn't read it all. It might be kind of common to sort of get away from reading in high school. And then, it doesn't make sense in college too, but then to come back to it later. But they have been reading and we've been excited about that. I was remembering as a faculty member at St. John's, I'm just guessing around 2015, talking about students and reading. And, I sort of wondered aloud to everyone, is reading really going to be a thing that most Americans, just to grab a group, do daily? And people sort of laughed like, oh, Tord, you say those outlandish things just for attention. Or is reading going to be kind of the primary way that people learn, as opposed to a video? Like, how do I change my could be how do I change my car battery or sorry, my lawnmower battery kind of video watching to learn. So people, I think, poo-pooed that at first in 2015. But then, sort of like, oh, yeah, maybe that's true. Um, so that I think certainly is a question. I could talk a long time. I'm mostly encouraged by my students. I'm continually surprised in a good way by the students I work with at App State of how many of them are doing the work. I do have a very open-ended classroom where most of what they read are peer-reviewed articles that they've chosen. So, or even passage essays, shorter, not short pieces, but not books, pieces out of a textbook collection that we have, or pieces out of a collection I've curated in a Google Drive folder. So I do think it helps that the reading they're doing, they have a lot of choice in, and the projects that they're working on are open-ended, as opposed to teaching juniors in a high school where we're reading American Lit and I'm assigning them Columbus travel journals, which I don't think is helping things. And I'm mostly against that, and I'm always open to being wrong. Okay, so I think the the piece rightly asks if reading is going to be a thing that most, really, if I clarify it, I think it asks, is reading going to be a thing that most Americans do? Because in the past, reading has been sort of a given that a certain segment, we'll say, of the United States population reads, even though we could extend a lot of this out beyond the United States. And then later in the piece, it gets into like, reading might be kind of a niche hobby, the way you might say, I garden or I play golf or I build, I don't know, do they say build Legos? Is that what people who build Legos say? And then reading will be like one of those things that's kind of a hobby that a certain smaller segment of people do. Okay, I'm just going to keep going on some quotes that will be fun for me to riff on that I hope you'll think are interesting. I, of course, want to hear what have you been reading? Comment at thetorg.com. Give me your opinions on reading at thetorg.com or on social media. Facebook, X are places that I am. Okay, here's that quote. Americans also get much less of their news through reading than they once did. In 1975, about half of 20-somethings said they read the newspaper every day. Today, less than 10% do. Most Americans now get the news on their phones and laptops, and 40% say they prefer to watch or listen to online news rather than read it. So, where do we get our news? I mean, I'll say, where do my kids get their news? They definitely get it from TikTok and Instagram. Um, and I think a certain segment of us, not me, even though I get it, will flip out thinking, oh my gosh, those girls get their information from the news. But there is credible news on TikTok and Instagram if you're properly equipped with the critical facilities to think through who posted this, why. Um, and I think my kids are pretty suspicious of everything they look at. Is this real? Now, they are, I think, probably fooled, and probably more fooled if they're reading about, if they're watching. Yeah, watch out. What does it mean to read is kind of interesting, which we may get to. Um, if they're watching a TikTok or Instagram reel about the war with Iran, I think they're more likely to be fooled by that than something that Trump did or something that Taylor Swift did, something that Timothy Chalamet or Caitlin Clark. I think my kids are more likely to sort of go to some other places within either the platform or a Google search. I don't know if they go anywhere else um, to get their news. They certainly watch podcasts in a way that I listen to them. Um, I do sometimes first get news from TikTok or not Instagram. I don't look at Instagram. I do sometimes get news from TikTok. Um, but then, go to the Times, go to USA Today, less so, see what Fox News is saying about it. I guess I'll talk about that now. Super regular, especially at night. This is kind of my routine. I go to ESPN and I'm mostly looking for, did anyone get traded? Um, did the other day, Caitlin Clark scored 45 points and had 10 assists, which has never been done in the WNBA before. So I'm looking for something like that on ESPN. I wish there was a better site than ESPN. I sometimes pop over to the Ringer. It doesn't really have what I want. I mean, the thing that is kind of gone is sort of like Game 6, Celtics, Lakers in the 80s, just a kind of in-depth piece on the game because I think there's an assumption that I know the score, that I kind of know the major beats, to use a writing term, of what happened in the game, which really I don't. So that article has sort of disappeared. I used to check out best sports writing of 2024 kind of anthologies, and also for magazine writing and also for science and technology writing. So I like those kind of pieces, and those don't really seem to be on ESPN, and maybe that's why I should subscribe to The Athletic, which I haven't done. But I do subscribe to a lot of other stuff, right? We all do. So I go to ESPN. Maybe I've talked too long on that. I go to the New York Times. I read the front page. Sometimes I like to click over on books, technology, real estate. Even though, my wife is the realtor, but like, for example, I really know the market in Blowing Rock and Boone. I look at that every day. I use Zillow, which I think realtors will be like, but I love drawing my little circles on Zillow for the maps. Anyway, I read the New York Times, and then I almost always go to Fox News, and you're like, Tor, you go to Fox News, but I go to Fox. I really am fascinated by comparing the headlines of the New York Times to what Fox News reports, and a lot of times there's like what you might expect is for Fox News, doesn't wherever you go first. I go to the New York Times first. So you might expect like the Fox News Trumpy version of what the New York Times has on the front page, but that's not really what it is. Really, they don't resemble each other. The things the New York Times chooses to put on its front page webpage and the things that Fox News chooses to put on the front page often have almost no overlap. So that's pretty interesting. And then and then sometimes if you go deeper, like I have to go deeper on Fox News to find the article about this thing happened, whatever. Vance said this thing and the New York Times reported on it. It's sort of buried at Fox News. And you could, I'm sure, go the other way around. And then I like to read the comments. Why do I read the comments more on Fox News than New York Times? I'm not sure. But I'm fascinated by the comments. So far, I haven't participated in that's not true. I have commented on the New York Times, like their best movies of the 21st century. I have commented on stuff like that. I've not yet lobbed any comments into Fox News, but I am fascinated by them. And then I read The Atlantic, and The Atlantic had a piece about, this comes from The Atlantic. The Atlantic recently had a piece about just, can people really sit still during movies these days? That sounds like an old man. I'm 55. But I honestly have some very specific complaints about some people in my life who are younger who talk constantly during the movies. And then I think related still, my wife and I went and saw Chris Stapleton and Lainey Wilson at Bank of America Stadium, and we just couldn't believe how much getting up and down everyone did around us. I mean, maybe, I don't know, they were selling alcohol in the aisles the way they would at a football game. So it wasn't like they had to get up to get a drink. Maybe they had to go to the bathroom. But just the amount of people not being able to sit still, people not being able to like watch a concert without filming everything. Certainly, attention spans is a piece of this article. Oh yeah, the diarrhea lettuce, right, guys? Are we through the worst of the diarrhea lettuce? Good article again on the Atlantic. I guess this is me. Why isn't the Atlantic sponsoring me? Why don't I work for the Atlantic and make more money podcasting? Guys, I don't make any money podcasting. Um, but the challenge of figuring out what the real news was about the diarrhea lettuce, which is the parasite that gives you super intense diarrhea, that, according to this article, when I read it, no deaths according to that. But that's, I think, one of I mean, my wife talked about it. I'd already experienced it. It was hard to figure out what was real about that. Could we eat raspberries? Was it just Taco Bell? This farm in Mexico, the shredded lettuce, was that the only thing we had to worry about? Um, I think I did sort of have a takeaway of like, people get versions of these parasites every summer, but the fact that there were the massive cases around the Taco Bells in Michigan raised the level of awareness about it. And so people were getting tested more. And so the cases were higher, even though maybe they were the same as they've been in most states in the past. Need a sip of water, guys. This podcasting by yourself stuff. Okay, this gets, I think, a little bit more into what does it mean to read? And yet, strangely, Americans are probably reading more words than ever before. What has changed is what they read and how. People are bombarded with emails, text messages, X posts, Reddit threads, Instagram captions. This explosion of textual fragments, what a great phrase, textual fragments, have come at the expense of devoting sustained attention to longer written works that convey rich and complicated information. Ooh, so much to talk about there. We're taking a quick break from the episode so I can tell you about my novel, Love on the Big Screen. It tells the story of a college freshman whose understanding of love has been shaped by late 80s romantic comedies such as 16 Candles and Say Anything. The second edition is available on Amazon as a Kindle book for only 99 cents. You can get the paperback for $9.99. You can go to thetorg.com. You can link to the book on Amazon. You also can put your email in as a subscriber, and you can find all of our old podcast episodes. A couple other things, we'd love for you to like and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this podcast, maybe at some place like Spotify. If you're feeling super generous, write us a podcast review on Apple Podcasts or write a review of my novel, Love on the Big Screen, on Amazon. Thank you so much. Back to the episode. It's this idea of tackling a long, complicated text that hasn't been assigned to me and no one has any leverage on to make me read it, even though I think like Doug Lemov book about teaching, sometimes about the principles of teaching pedagogy applied to sports. Those are a little bit drier, complex texts. Or James Paul G about discourses and literacy, what counts for literacy. Those are, I think, those kinds of texts that I still enjoy reading and rereading. But there certainly is a certain amount of me that's like, great, I'm not a student. I can read what I want, and I cannot finish things that I don't want to read. Okay. So what counts as reading or what counts as writing actually comes up a lot more. For me, I certainly, if we think of a wedding invitation as a genre, a text that does work for people, genre being we don't have to invent a way to invite people to a wedding. We already have this genre that works. And then disciplines having genres, whether it's a legal brief, or a scouting report in basketball or a budget. And then trying to bring those concepts to a TikTok post, a YouTube post, an Instagram post, sure, a YouTube video, sure, related genres, but also pretty specifically their own, meaning, what what you're doing to try to get people, whatever your cause is, whatever your event is, you want people to come to, whatever argument you're trying to make on TikTok, needs to be done differently on Instagram or Facebook or YouTube. So just trying to broadly apply those concepts to all of those texts, thinking in terms of creating, composing them, writing them, but also reading them in the idea of audience. So opposite of what what's her name? Rose's argument is, I'm certainly trying to help students think about how cover letters or TikToks or an academic profile might stand out from each other, and that you do read a YouTube post, you do read a website, of course, but it has embedded images and video, um, and that writing an effective YouTube post, creating one, composing one, does count as writing. And that's why my class that I teach, I try not to say my class, the courses I'm assigned to teach about writing across the curriculum, where we talk about things like disciplinary awareness, that is reading and that is writing. And that's why this class matters more than if you're reading novels and writing about um, themes, which is kind of what they expect sometimes. Okay. Do I noticed in this article, I think she was counting, or a study she was referring to, she's counting audiobook as reading. That is a tricky one. I think I would say I've read, I guess if you ask me if I read, and I'm spacing the novel, because when I used to drive from Asheville to Queens, New York City, um, like a Stephen King was a pretty reliable guy that I could get I had Audible and I would get a novel and it would pretty much take about the drive, right? 12 hours. Sometimes I would have 2 hours of music or podcast after I finished the entire novel. If you said, did you read Stephen King's, The Green Mile, and I'd listened to it, I think I would say I listened to the audiobook. So I think one, what counts as counting, and maybe counting is overrated, but I know like Coach App's teacher at Hardin Park, um, JV coach who I work with closely at Watauga High School in Boone, North Carolina. She sets goals like reading 100 books, and I think she counts audiobooks. So I will give that to you. I would usually clarify that I listened to the audiobook. I didn't read it. But I think overall I say yes, it counts, even though I didn't know I was going to say that. Um, Pretty obvious, I guess. I ran reading, concentrating as stamina that can be increased. I almost launched into, I so I've run 3 marathons long ago. Um, and then this June, maybe late May, I decided I would try to run that Mountaineer 4 mile race, which sounds like next to nothing coming from a marathon. But I had to train that. I mean, I could really dig in and suck it up and run 3 miles at the Valley Crucis Park when I started all that, but it was bad. I mean, you'd say, look at that guy fast walking, or, I was, I think people would be worried about me when they saw me running 3 miles in May, but, wanted to be able to run 4 miles and wanted to be able to run it harder. Again, I'm not going to share my time. It's too embarrassing. I guess you could look it up, but certainly I stretched my stamina back out again and could stretch it much farther if that's what I wanted to do, at the limits of probably knees and at least one Achilles that gets sore. But the idea that concentrating and reading complex text for long periods of time is something that you work on the same way you would work on running farther. I certainly subscribe to that, and it's something I share a lot. And there's a decent little section in this devoted to that. I actually started writing about Gen AI. And when I say Gen AI, I mean Gemini, which I use, which presents you a box that you type into, and GenAI writes you back as if you're texting your friend. Of course, we could go deeper on that. I think interesting that I've become a Gemini person mostly, and my wife is a Chat GPT person. Her favorite thing, I think, being um, putting in a picture of a house we've looked at and asking for suggestions on one what might do to improve the front of that house or landscaping. Okay, but I think I want to say that I use Gen AI almost every day. Can I think of some examples? Even if I say, uh, I think better, am I going to say better? Of course, Spotify will do this for you, but if I say I like running to the Chemical Brothers, insert name of song, can you give me some more songs in that genre? And I like running to the Hoosiers theme music to get started. So Gen AI does a good job of, giving me 10 songs, two of which I add to my playlist, and then Spotify suggests some more songs based on that song. So I use it for stuff like that a lot. I've sort of gone back and forth with it about um, how many three-pointers should my high school team shoot. And then I noticed that recently Gen AI, I think this week, was banned in the major leagues because people were using it for like, what pitch should we throw here? Um, so that stuff's kind of interesting. Interesting to ban it too. So I think I'm using Gen AI in the way that I use computers and cell phones, knowing the dangers and damages it causes the world, the same as do our roads that we drive cars on. So, you know, are we biking everywhere? So there's a certain acceptance of what's harmful, open to different arguments. But what do we lose if we're just using Gen I think, to do the cliched thing, which is me, Tor, gave out a prompt in the writing class, and the student puts the prompt in Gen AI and then copies and pastes what Gen AI produces, or uses Gen AI to get all of their ideas to respond to a text. So what do we lose? I think just a couple of quick things. Um, Writing as a tool for knowing, writing as a tool for knowing. So, for me, going back to the late 80s and early 90s, looking someone like Donald Murray who wrote in a voice that I could access easily, um, in a non-stuffy conversational way, who had a book called Write to Learn. You don't just write to share what you know in an email. You struggle with writing. Maybe I shouldn't use that word. You wrestle with writing. You work the puzzle of writing. And when you're done working the puzzle, you know stuff that you didn't know before. A really sappy or more cliched way is, you're in a relationship that's causing you a lot of angst, and you write about it for 3 pages. And when you're done writing, you understand some things about the relationship that you didn't know. I have my second book, The Coach's Wife. I certainly felt like a victim of divorce, and I felt as if my wife left me. And when I finished writing that fictional book, which, contains things that didn't happen in my marriage that I maybe heard about in other marriages, um, when I was done writing that book, I certainly saw all the ways that I contributed to the divorce, that I didn't see before I started writing it. So that's writing as a tool for knowing. And if all you do is copy and paste results from Gen I, then um, you aren't wrestling with it. In the same way, you're not wrestling with a peer-reviewed text to learn all the specialized vocabulary that we might call a lexis, uh, in linguistics. Um, you're not wrestling with that stuff so that you know it in the way that you hope, your doctor knows it, your accountant maybe knows it. Okay. And the other thing I was thinking about, you could go on forever about this stuff. What do you lose if you're using Gen AI, Chat GPT, or Gemini or Copilot, etc. You still have to know stuff. And you have to know stuff to use Gen AI the way that you have to know stuff to do a Google search or know stuff to use a library data search. So sure, you can look anything up you want on Google, but if you don't have some knowledge of what to put in that search box or to say, then you're just as poorly off as you would be. I mean, a couple examples. I mean, there's a guy named Dean Oliver who I think of as sort of the founder, that's going too far, an early, really important voice in basketball analytics who might say, don't take that contested mid range to give you an, to where if that's not your thing, you're like, oh, why not? You know, that's a low percentage shot. Whereas if you shoot wide open threes or you shoot layups or you try to get fouled, that's a lot better than taking a, a contested mid-range jumper. I think Coach McCarthy at McDowell might tell me maybe he's never had a team shoot better from two than they did for three. That probably isn't right. He has a stat that's something like that, maybe about opponents. So I'm saying really basic things if you're a basketball analytics person, but things you may not have heard about. But if you haven't heard of Dean Oliver and you haven't read stuff he's written or read his book, I think he's got two. I mean, I think it was Basketball on Paper. If you don't know that stuff and you haven't read that stuff, then you can't use Gemini to figure things out because you don't know any of those things to put in. And I mean, a really cliched example. And the students, I do something I call experiments with Gen AI in writing, and I worked that into my class a couple times. If you're copying and pasting the reflections that you're supposed to write, and you're suddenly using, for example, a word like pedagogy, um, and not only using the word pedagogy, but using about 7 words in your reflection that I predict you don't know, you look silly. I can certainly say, Bob, you've used this word pedagogy. How are you defining that? I mean, and I'm not hammering people. I'm not trying to be a cop. I'm not a cop. Being a cop is a good thing to want to do with your life, honorable thing. But that's not what I'm doing, and I'm not trying to catch people cheating. I'm trying to help people grow in their ability to think and learn and pursue their goals and be ambitious. Side note, grade inflation is interesting. I don't know if it's as big a deal as some people make it. But circling back here, for example, my students, we write a profile on a writing portfolio that is supposed to be for the audience at App State. So when it comes to your academic interests, your professional interests, it makes sense that some of your passions or clubs or you play a sport or you have a job, it makes sense that those things would find their way into your profile on your portfolio. Um, One thing I do in class is we all try to be an audience for each other. So you start to see how silly you look when you produce a profile on your portfolio, mostly through Gen AI. And it's like, wow, we've got 5 or 6 pretty poorly written profiles because people didn't put enough time into it and they need to work on it more. And we've got a middle 15 that are interesting and stand out in a good way, but ways that are different because people worked on them and thought about them. And then we have really sometimes only one, sometimes 3, where the student has mostly copied and pasted from Gen AI and they look silly and it's kind of embarrassing if that student really does look at their classmates' work. They're like, oh boy. And what they don't know, and what I try to show them, which of course I can't show them all, is that if you're flipping through resumes or you're flipping through cover letters or you're flipping through pages on a company's website, or you're even getting emails from a supervisor, you don't know how much you're being dismissed if what you're doing is copying and pasting from Gen AI. It's like, I read 3 sentences of what you wrote and I moved on because of the way you use Gen AI, and I'm not saying don't use it. And I dismissed you, and you don't know why you're being dismissed, but that's why. Or you don't know why you look silly to everyone else in the class, and you don't even realize it. And of course, class can be work, right? Or class can be applying for the job. Okay, so she goes into really interesting things, and I just kind of riffed on superficially. Um, just the kind of fragmented text world we live in. I got a couple more here to go. So one, two, I think just two more quotes from the article. Here we go. And unlike speech, we're talking about books here. And unlike speech, it doesn't disappear into the ether. Readers can return to a text to plummet for new meaning and understanding. Because writing endures, individuals can temporarily forget what they've written, but trust that it won't be lost forever. So I'll circle back to a little bit more about what she's saying. But one of the things I like about books is someone has taken the time to pull the text together. So let me do this first. So one of the things one of the last five books I've read, which I'm going to list later, I'm reading The Contemporary American Essay. That's a collection edited by Philip Lopate, and I should know if I'm saying Philip's name right or not, but I'm not positive. Lopate. How else would you say it? But Philip, with probably some help, um, put that collection together, and it's not even a themed collection, right? You can read a themed collection about sustainable eating. You can read a themed collection about grief. But this one doesn't have a theme. In some ways, the best American science writing doesn't necessarily have a theme deeper than science either. But someone curated it. And to me, I've read 15 essays that were published elsewhere in a magazine or on a website that I would have never read had not someone curated them in a book. So I'll go one further and say, if I scroll back up here, it's true that Rose Horowitz's piece could live for 100 years or more, who knows, 1,000 years, on the Atlantic website. And it isn't disappearing into the ether because they have archives and you can always go back and find his Rose's piece. And the Atlantic does a pretty good job of showing you things that were published a while ago but are relevant now. However, I think when you gather those thoughts in a book that gets published, they don't disappear into the ether. And I do think that's a good reason to buy books, to read books, and to write books. Take even my dad, really mom too. For years, dad wrote down almost every day in a diary his workout. Now, that at later, when he was in his 80s, might have included like, I walked from one end of the house to the other 40 times and I felt pretty good. He maybe wrote that with Parkinson's at 82 in a runner's journal. But going back into his 40s, I ran 3 laps around the horseshoe in the park in Winamac, Indiana. And then sometimes, for some periods of his life, kept a diary. Um, I kept some of those. There were boxes of them. I didn't keep them all. Those thoughts have disappeared into the ether, which is maybe fine. And there's all kinds of reasons that was good for dad to do, even though it disappeared into the ether for everyone but him. And mom kept pretty specific journals of going to Europe with my sister Anne, again, some of which I kept, but have disappeared into the ether. But I think it's a reason I might do a collection kind of based around places we've lived. The first house I ever lived in was on Hillcrest Drive in Logansport, Indiana. That's where I went when I came home from the hospital. And we moved across the street, the literal across the street. I could stand in the front yard of Hillcrest House number 1 and hit it Hillcrest House number 2 with a baseball. Probably a football. You can throw a baseball farther, right? But that gathering all that stuff into a book, I think makes it more likely that a family member down the road or my daughters or anyone might read that book. So I like this point about disappearing into the ether. Whereas if I wrote the same things as blog posts, um, I think those do disappear into the ether. But there's also a book like Hail Mary or The Martian. No, The Martian is the one that was website posts first and then gets collected as a book. And I find it much later after there's a movie. And then I go all the way back to something that used to be posts on a website, but read the book, The Martian. So I like that point. Okay. And then um, a little bit about what I have left is attention spans. One more quote from the book. Last five books I read and enjoyed. And then did I watch any other stories this week? Here we go. This is a quote from the article again. Faced with shrinking attention spans and declining comprehension, schools might have been expected to resist the impulse towards shorter passages and shallower reading. Instead, they spurted on. A 2025 survey showed that most middle and high school teachers assign 0 to 4 books a year. 0 to 4. Now, assigning a book, is that the best thing to do in a classroom? I tend to think no. I didn't know I was going to be talking about Coach Epps again. Um, Coach Epps got married. She wants to stay Coach Epps in the basketball world. Congratulations, Richard and Coach Epps. But she, I think has found a way. I used to use the accelerated reader, where the point wasn't the tests. The point was lots of choice for students. And I think there are different ways to do that. Um, but there's a lot of independent reading. And if as a teacher, every kid's the goal, it's not going to be every kid. If every kid in the class is reading the novel of choice and loving it, and they can't wait, and they look forward to that time when there's 30 or 45 minutes and they've built up the stamina to read a novel or a book of nonfiction, that's fantastic. And that's um, one of the best things you can do, I think, as a teacher. So I'm not going to say yes to sign books, but I will say at least partially guilty of giving in to students' reluctance to read. So in some ways giving up while at the same time trying to draw students in to the reading. And can certainly, if you want to argue with me, I can just make the case that I haven't given up and I'm getting kids to read more than they would. It has to do with choice assignments on one level, which is like going into the textbook and here's 19 pieces in our textbook. Pick any of them you want to read, do these responses, post it as an assignment now on the learning management system Canvas. I'm glancing at that and you're getting points for doing that work, which you could not read the whole thing, but you probably have had to engage in the text a little bit. And then now that you've had that assignment, now you come to class more prepared than you would have. And that's me doing something different because if we're going to discuss this reading, there just aren't, if all I'm saying is read this so we can talk about it on Tuesday, or I'm giving you a quick quiz, I'm not getting the results I'm getting with assigning you to take these notes almost the way I took notes for this podcast, and turning it in on a Canvas assignment. And now I'm sitting with 5 people, including me or whatever, right? 3 or 5. And we've all read something and we've all prepared some notes. And I'm calling that a reading workshop. And I'm sharing quotes the same way that I'm sharing quotes with you, but everyone's doing that. And we haven't all read the same thing. But let's go back to Bob. Bob read this piece and I'm like, man, I didn't even notice that one. That's great. I love that line. And now next week, I read the piece that Bob read, and these are all related to literacy and disciplinary awareness because of the class I teach. And those things sort of organically maybe pop up later when we're doing our own work in our own disciplines of choice. So that's kind of how reading is working in my class. And I remember getting assigned, to read 5 books of fiction in a week for the workshop. And I think to give my professors a break, that was recommended reading around whatever we were going to talk about in the next workshop. But it also read as an assignment that was impossible that I didn't do, and I think almost no one did. Maybe no one did. And so, in that sense, shame on you, Torg, for not reading. But on the other hand, I had I think it was called Poetry and Poetics, and maybe the book had almost the same title. And I came to the first day of class as a 30-year-old, kind of old graduate student in an MFA program, and having read that whole textbook, every essay in the whole book, with notes because I liked it, um, or was pretty interested in it, as opposed to maybe not choosing to read those 5 books every week in the fiction class. Just examples, not picking on anybody or just, sort of somewhat hypothetical examples, even though mostly true. Okay, last two things that I'm touching on. Last 5 books I read and enjoyed. I already told you the contemporary essay by Philip Lope. Hmm. Oh no, and I got a list of a couple of things I read out of that this week. Okay, other books I read. Rapture, as in the Toronto Raptors by Nick Nurse. And I think Nick Nurse helped give me the confidence to experiment on the basketball court as a coach and a teacher. And then also just to ditch things that I don't think are going to work, and to take chances and to think outside the box. Those are all things, that I tend to anyway. But a guy like Nick Nurse, a guy like Doc Rivers, um, just give me sort of the extra oomph. It's like, it's fine. You think I need to do A, B, and C, but I'm not going to do any of that. The way, sorry, savvy coaching, I don't always disagree. You can say simplicity always wins. Fine. You can say that. It sounds awesome, but sometimes a scheme that no one's seen before also wins. Every love story is a ghost story. That's a biography about the writer David Foster Wallace that I loved, that certainly complicated the way I think about David Foster Wallace by D.T. Max. Heartland, I can't believe this is a book about Larry Bird, Heartland being like Indiana. Larry Bird mostly at Indiana State, if not entirely at Indiana State, by Keith O'Brien. It was great. And it was almost like a 280-page research project. I guess, that's what a lot of books are, but maybe not a lot of books that I read. Meaning, he talked to a lot of people, but he also read a lot of articles and just brought all this information that's scattered everywhere about Larry Bird into one book called Heartland. I should have asked, I've never heard Keith talk, but I should have asked him if he wanted to come on the podcast. I probably could have asked um, Rose it's not Horowitz, it's I'm not sure. No, it is Horowitz. I think I misspelled it over here. Horowitz. The end of reading is here. I probably could have asked her if she was interested. I don't know if she would be, but I didn't really decide what I was doing until last night. And then I read, and I told my friend Dave Witzig this, True and False Magic by Phil Stutz. I went from a Netflix, what's that director's name? His psychologist, or what do you call a psychologist who doesn't have a PhD? And this Phil, I think, Phil Stutz wrote the book, and it's about the 3 constants. You're always going to have pain. You're always going to have uncertainty. You're always going to have the need for constant work. And if you embrace those 3 things, um, you make a lot of progress. You have a lot more peace of mind. I find that to be true. I could do a whole podcast on true and false magic. And then finally, did I read or watch any other stories this week? The Empathy Exams by Leslie Jameson. She acts like a patient for medical students. So the piece was about that. Domestic Gulags by Laura Kipnis. It's just a huge list like this. Here's an example. Let's say I'm reading you one, and there's at least 150 things like this about being in relationships. You can't be a slob. You can't do less than 50% around the house, even if the other person wants to do 100 or 200% more house cleaning than you find necessary or even reasonable. I picked that one out a little bit. I'm not complaining. There's so much you could say about me, right? But what I would do to get this house ready to sell, my spouse Megan wants to do 200% more getting it ready to sell. And I think that will serve us well financially. But that sentence made me giggle. And Megan could say the same thing about me in a different right aspect of our relationship. And I think that's what makes the piece funny. Okay, two more. And yeah, it is Anne. And Death and the Maiden, and Death and the Maiden by David Lazar. It's about an old relationship. It's a relationship full of drinking, full of jealousy. I guess you would say some cheating, unless you wanted to say it was an open relationship in which a partner takes their life. So heart-wrenching, fascinating, really good one. Maybe I'm like, why do I need to say I liked it the best? And then this is crass. This is explicit. I'm sorry that something like this would make me laugh. Should I not apologize? Certainly not certainly some of my players' parents wouldn't approve of The Hawk. Some of them are watching. Anyway, The Hawk stars Will Ferrell. It certainly evokes Happy Gilmore. It contains as many homages to Happy Gilmore, the golf movie with Adam Sandler. It stars Molly Shannon of SNL. Luke Wilson is someone you would know. My daughter Izzy, I mean, we're in the car and she'll be like, Dad, can we watch The Hawk when we get home? So I would assume this is hitting. My daughter Charlotte offended me. She said, this is pretty much Ted Lasso. And I drew the distinction that Ted Lasso is someone to admire. He always tries to do the right thing. Ted Lasso is an inspiring character. The Will Ferrell character makes me laugh, but he's a terrible father, a terrible husband, a bad, just as he's intensely flawed. Not that we all aren't. But he is making me laugh, and I do hope that his character will turn it around. It introduced me to the comedian Fortune Feimster, who both my kids knew from social media. She's hilarious. She becomes Will Ferrell's caddy, and I root for her intensely, and I root for them as a duo. And I feel heartbroken when Will's character, the Heart, is mean to Fortune. So I did watch that. All right. So that is the end of reading here. The end of reading is not here. Even the author says the end of reading is not here, even though she has a very provocative title, but maybe it will become a niche hobby. So hope this worked for you solo. I feel happy to have made it. Safe travels to Anne as she comes back from Prague. Hopefully she'll be back with us next week. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Smart takes the shot, and the Hoosiers with 3 seconds. Go ahead.
But what we found out is that each one of us is a brain and an athlete
and a basket case, a princess,
and a criminal. Does that answer your question?
I love you guys.